What's going on, golf fans? It's your boy, GS Luke, here with our DFS live stream for this week's Truist Championship. Going to go over any of your questions down there in chat, a look at the weather report out there before rounds 1 and 2, give you guys an idea of some of the strategy, ownership heading into lock as well, and then we'll look at some of the contests available, some lineup construction over there on DraftKings as well, and put it all together for you before you enter your lineups. So hopefully you're having a fantastic week. Wednesday is one of my favorite days of the week, and anytime we have a new golf course like this, it's like the day before Christmas for me, because we end up getting very interesting slates when we haven't seen a golf course before, some prevailing narratives that you might be able to go out there and leverage against out there for DFS as well. So we'll talk about different ways that you can approach this slate to go out there and make it a good one. But anything else you're curious about, just go ahead and let me know down in the chat. But we already got Jay down there, Go Collect as well, also BG Little Neck. Hopefully you guys are having a swell day. C Floyd as well. Brant says long hitter Luke. It wasn't quite the long hitter Luke out there on the golf course today, but we had some fun out there in the links. We got Rick rolled down there, Go Collect with his pounded Luke down there, and let's have ourselves a week. Absolutely. And just like Mike said there, go ahead, smash the like button if you guys haven't already either. But let's start it off with a talk about the golf course. And I'm not going to be the kind of tout that tells you that I know exactly what's going to happen this week, but let's talk about what you do on weeks like this on the PGA Tour. When we have a brand new golf course, there's going to be a lot of content out there that tries to give people an idea of how the golf course is going to play. And while sometimes it might be exactly spot on, going after that content might be a really good idea, there have also been plenty of times in the past where it hasn't gone according to the industry standard. Maybe conditions weren't quite up to par. Maybe it was softer than people were expecting, or maybe the golf course just played into a different type of skill set for one reason or another. There could be 1,000 different reasons why that can go out there and happen. But I can tell you, as somebody that's been doing this for 4 or 5 years over here on YouTube, that I've gotten things wrong plenty of times out there on tour. And, if I've gotten things wrong, I can guarantee you that other content creators have as well in the process. And I've seen it before myself. You saw it even just a few weeks ago with how people thought that, a couple weeks ago, long golf course, CJ Byron Nelson was going to play out there just last week. A lot of people were looking for putting first sort of players. And if you take a look at that leaderboard, it was a lot more bomber heavy than you would have thought. So on a week like this, to get to the chase here, I like to go out there and fade that prevailing narrative. A lot of times there'll be, certain quote unquote key stats that people are throwing out that end up being baloney by the end of the week. And a few things that I've noticed out there in the industry, not saying that these are going to be wrong. I'm just going to let you know where other people are going. So maybe you can consider going another direction, is I've seen a lot of people talking about wedge play this week. It is a short par 70. So again, I don't know if that's really incorrect over there, but a lot of people are going to be focusing on those players. And I heard bomber narrative from a few people as well. And while I agree that there are some bunkers that you can carry on this golf course, it is also a softer week. They've gotten some rain over here in Philly, so it's probably going to be playing a little bit longer than usual out there over the first few rounds. It's a short par 70. So, while you might have some of these narratives that people are throwing out there, I don't know if it's a big enough push or a big enough edge out there at this golf course that your player pool should only be bombers. It should only be guys that are really good on bent grass or only really good wedge players. Like I've heard some people saying, form heading in could be a really good way to evaluate your pool. So rather than focusing on this key stat or another, right, trying to guess how the golf course is going to play, why not just play guys that are playing well heading into this event, right? Why not simplify it as much as humanly possible and take the guys with good form? Now, you can't just take good form players in all 6 spots, because that's probably 6 chalky players you're using in a lineup. But that kind of idea could be how you simplify it out there in your process this week. Maybe you see a lot of people going to bombers and you say, you know what? Maybe it plays to an accuracy week. Maybe it's more about being positional off the tee. I actually see a way, and based on what I see with this golf course, that it is an accuracy first golf course. In fact, that's what I'm playing out there for my player poll this week, right? That's the narrative that I'm choosing to go down, because I don't think a lot of other people are going to be choosing to do so. So whatever that narrative is for you, and maybe it is going after bombers, I don't want to completely dismiss that. It is probably going to be the most popular narrative that people are going with, but whatever the case may be, pick your lane on a week like this and run with it, because nobody knows for certain how this golf course is going to play. Some people probably know better than others because of personal experience on the golf course. So if you're going to lean towards something, I don't have any problems with leaning into those sort of narratives, but have an idea of what you're looking for out there in players. A week like this grants us an opportunity that we don't see very often. A lot of times after we've seen a golf course 1 or 2 times out there on tour, I don't want to say that we've quote unquote figured them all out or anything like that. But the sports books, your models, even your pricing over there on DraftKings starts to account for course fit at some point. And, you see it at a lot of those positional courses, Pete Dye special, Siwoo Kim is always priced up a little bit. This, if you want to be early out there to a narrative, it's the perfect spot to do so, especially if you don't agree with the popular sentiment out there, because it could be a little bit lower owned. So this week, my take is a lot different than what other people in the industry seem to think for this course. So it's really easy for me to lean into that sort of game theory. Maybe you're somebody that isn't, a pro when it comes to playing PGA DFS. You just want to go out there and find a way to get different out there this week. You could pick anything. I think the form way would be a really good way to go out there and do so. If you want to look for some accuracy guys like I am, I don't think that that's a terrible idea. If you just want to look at second shot only, it is going to be a wet golf course with dartboards for greens out there. That could be a narrative that you go after. If you want to use the bomber narrative, hell, you could make that where you go out there and you build lineups around. I think building it sets, as my guy Tyler Tamboline says all the time over here in SHIPIT Nation, is a really, really good idea on a slate like this. So I just wanted to start there because in my opinion, these kind of weeks when we have a completely new setup are some of the biggest edges that we have in PGA DFS, because not only can you play the game theory angle out there with your lineups, forcing in leverage out there into your builds, you can play the game theory angle against the skill set that everyone thinks is going to get the job done. And, if it ends up being more of a short course specialist, and by the way, it doesn't even just have to be the off the tee play that gets there. Here's my take on the golf course, by the way, because I've kind of mentioned it a little bit. I'll just go ahead and get it out there right off the bat. I think that off the tee play is like a wash this week. I think being a bomber is always going to be great, but with how soft the course is and with the chance for it being lift clean in place the first few rounds, I want guys that can hit fairways as well, because they're going to be able to give themselves a perfect lie out there into greens. And because of how receptive they are, they're going to be able to spin pretty much everything from a 7-iron and shorter out there, from like 7-iron to your wedges. Some of your longer clubs are probably going to one hop and stop out there on the greens if, and that's a huge if over here, if you're hitting from the fairway. So my take on the golf course is that off the tee, I think being a bomber would be helpful, but I also think that being accurate is also going to be helpful around here. So I hate to say that, like, I don't care how people are playing off the tee. Obviously, Nick Dunlap losing like 3 strokes per round off the tee matters. Now, what I am saying though is that if you're somebody that gains like a half a stroke off the tee and it's with your accuracy, and you're also somebody that gains a half a stroke off the tee and you do it with your power, I don't really have a lean towards one player or the other. Where I do go out there and I'm going after my player pool this week is with the second shot from 175 yards and in. Almost every approach shot, with the exception of 4 out there per round, is going to be from at most 175 yards. There's some 2 difficult par 3s. There are 2, maybe even 3 par 4s. We're going to have over 175 yards and in, but outside of those 4, maybe 5 holes around the golf course, the other 13 are going to be extremely scoreable. So I know people were mentioning quote unquote wedges, that kind of thing. I think you're going to see a lot of 8 and 9 irons out there from the players this week as well. So I wouldn't just say wedges out there for those sort of players. And I'm also looking for some bent grass putting as well. We know that it's bent grass. We know that they're pretty quick as well from what players have said out there. So if you want to look at some fast bent grass stats, as I have out there in my analysis, then that can be the narrative that you go with. But whatever the case may be, whatever sort of lean that you're going to go with for this week, have a reason for it. And I guess the one thing I will say about some of those longer players is don't be surprised if out there in GBPs that they're a little bit higher owned than you might expect. So like your Minwoos, your Keith Mitchells, the guys that hit it a long way off the tee, I'm not talking about double the ownership on those sort of players, but let's say that they're projected, let's say a Keith Mitchell, for example, I think I have around let me actually just bring it up so we don't have to even guess out there with Keith Mitchell. But I think I have him around like 9% ownership. Let me give you guys an exact number here. A little bit over 9% ownership out there in my projections. If I'm right about the Bombers being the most predominant narrative, that he might be like 11, 12% owned when we wake up over there tomorrow morning. So again, not talking about like double the ownership out there on some of those narratives, but there's a chance that you see some steam out there on those longer players. So that's what I've got out there from the golf course perspective. I know maybe a little bit more time that we spend unusual out there from that perspective, but it's a unusual week out there for the PGA Tour. In terms of your weather, we're not going to have a massive edge out there for the first few days, just because tee times are about 2-hour spread. So your first tee time is around 11:09 Eastern time. So and the last tee time over here is going to be at 1:10 p.m. So only 2 hours from the first to the last tee time, which doesn't give you much of a spread at all to go and find any sort of a weather edge. Maybe for Showdown, because you can be very specific over there in Showdown, you might be able to find a slight edge out there for maybe the last 2 to 4 rounds. But out here on Thursday, I don't see a big edge when it comes to the Showdown perspective. Winds are pretty flat the entire day. They're starting around noon. The temperatures are also going to be pretty consistent. And if you wanted to be super nitpicky, like sure, it could be a little firmer and faster out there for the last hour or so, but it's only a 2-hour spread out there from, and that's the most extreme example that you can find in the field, right? Most tee times and groups are only going to be spread off by like a half an hour to an hour at the very most in most cases. So weather for Showdown, not going to be a big factor. Tomorrow, I think they're going to shoot the grass off this golf course. They could see a lot of low scores out there with the receptive greens, not a whole lot of rough out there from what I've heard. Pin locations going to be a big factor here because this golf course does have a lot of slope to it. But the first round at a golf course, they're not going to go overboard when it comes to that kind of stuff. They're not going to use the Sunday pin locations out there on a Thursday when it's the first time that these guys have seen this kind of a track. So Thursday, I think, is a washout. I don't see any sort of an edge over that 2-hour window. And then if we go over here to the NAM model on Friday, it looks like it's going to be rainy early in the day. But just like they're doing over there for Thursday, they're not starting until 11. So the rain is supposed to kind of stop by then. Maybe they have some cleanup to do on the golf course where they have to move back lock like an hour and a half, that kind of thing. They should still be able to finish if that's the case. And the temperatures look pretty flat. It's a little bit cooler than what you had over there for Thursday. So topping out at about 60 degrees as opposed to the 75 that you have for tomorrow. So I think conditions in general are going to be a little bit harder because not only do you have those cooler temperatures, but also a little bit more wind than what you had there for Thursday. And we'll look at a few of the other models for Friday just because it's a little bit further out. Maybe not as consistent or as reliable a forecast when it's that far out. You can see this GFS model, which is fully loaded in for Friday, is calling for rain early in the day. And then as the day goes on, pretty much right about when they're going to start, it tapers off and then the winds start to kick up. So maybe you want some later starters on Friday just based on this GFS forecast that we're looking at. But that's only one of like the 4 or 5 models here. In fact, if you go over here to the ECM model over here on Friday, it's calling for the exact opposite. It's calling for the storms to come in a little bit later on in the day, which would actually favor some of the earlier starters over there on a Friday's round. So I'm not playing the weather at all out there in my lineups. Last week, I told you I put 10% out there in either direction out there for my lineups. This week, it's 0%. And I'm playing 300 lineups out there for this kind of week. So a little bit more volume than what I'm used to out there for any given week, because with that course stuff that I was talking about before, where I think that a lot of people are convinced that they know what's going to happen for this golf course, that I want to leverage against that, right? If everyone is just so sold that they know it's going to play this exact way, then I'll go out there and zig while everyone else is going out there and zagging and see if I can go out there and get some low-owned plays. So that's what I'm doing out there from the weather perspective. Really not much out there in my exposure. We'll be tracking the weather out there tomorrow to see if perhaps there's something that we can learn from out there for rounds 2 through 4. But as of right now, nothing that I see out there personally. And rounds 3 and 4, we might not have the same threesome format, but because they already have the round 2 tee times made, it's going to be the same thing out there for Friday. So when we get to the round 2 showdown stream out there tomorrow night, unfortunately, we're probably not going to be looking at much of a weather edge. Now, that rain could change things up a little bit, but I'm not counting on it as of right now. Let me bring up my projections. So what we're going to do next is talk through some of the ownership and game theory, and of course, any of the player pool deep dives that you want. So this is a spreadsheet where we can go through some of the ownership towards the top. We're going to go through a few players that I'm using just to give you some perspective on what I'm looking for in players. And, this isn't a show. We're going to get a whole bunch of picks and plays. It's going to be a lot more process-based over here on this channel, which is what you're always going to get over there with the SHIPIT Nation, but also something that I preach over there in the content that I do on my YouTube channel, LukeDFS. But we are going to go through a few plays down towards the bottom just to show you what I'm thinking when I'm getting to plays. You don't necessarily have to go out there and use them yourself. If you agree with me, then by all means, go out there, play them in lineups, go out there and get that leverage. But it's more so the thought process that I want you to take from this segment. But any sort of deep dives that you want, go ahead and let me know down in chat. I've got all the shots gained metrics to go out there and look at. We can look at last 24 rounds, so the last month or so out there on tour, how these guys have been playing. playing. We take a look at the last 12 measured rounds. Event history is pretty useless, so we'll probably skip that tab just because it was at a different golf course. But we can look at some recent form over here as well. So any of that, go ahead and let me know, but catch up on chat, see what's going on. Where did we leave off? Course looks rad. Yeah, man. I've never played PCC, but from everything you've told me, seems like it's going to be an absolute blast. So have some fun out there, man. You're not a fan of the no cut. I tend to like it, but hey, everyone likes different things, right? Can't blame you for that. Michael says, and a few minutes late, but you made it. Better to have you late than never. No cut is beat. I would rather have a cut, but it doesn't make that much of a difference for me. Primo says, what's up, bro? What's going on yourself? I'm doing well. Played some golf today. Played with a few buddies over there, 12 holes before I had to get out of there. Didn't play particularly well, but I was driving it well. So I at least had that going for me. We're in Philly, so a cheesesteak could make some sense. Yeah, a little cheesesteak hoagie. I see what you're doing right there. What's going on, Ross? Welcome on in. In a no cut, does that change the lineup build? See, let's talk about it. So I know some people don't seem to like the no cut stuff, which I get it, right? There's drama involved with the cut. It's an extra sweat over there on Friday. I'm all for it as well. But it does change the strategy just a little bit because you don't have the missed cut equity. You could still have guys finishing in like 40th this week. But if they make 20, 25 birdies, that could be enough to get there in DFS. And not necessarily like the $525 GPP. You're probably not going to take down like a 100K, 200K contest with somebody that's finishing in 40th. But if you're entering a single entry against a couple hundred other people and you've got 3 of the top 5, something like that, and then one guy is like in 40th, that kind of thing, you can still take down a GPP if that guy is going out there and making a lot of birdies. So what I normally do to change my process, Mike, is I weigh birdie or better percentage a little bit more just because we know that they have 4 rounds. And on DraftKings, we mentioned it a lot out there for the showdown perspective, but it's all about how many birdies you make, those streaks, bogey-free round, extra points that you can add on top of that. If you're going out there and making a whole bunch of pars, maybe making like 3 birdies, 1 bogey out there per round, it might look okay from your placement, but you're not going to do very well with your DraftKings lineup with those sort of guys out there. So I am looking for the more aggressive players in this sort of format. Because we have those 4 guaranteed rounds, I will take a lot more risk on those sort of guys. And down low, Mike, I'm actually going to have a few examples of those kind of players for you that are high upside, high birdie makers, good par 5 scorers as well, to go out there and get you those DraftKings points. You live here? He said, get to Angelo's in South Philly. Next year for Aronimik, I may be up there for the PGA Championship. So I'll see you then, and we'll have to hit up Angelo's when I do so. What's going on, Ross? He says, this stream is about the Truist, but before you end, curious if I played anything for Myrtle Beach. Yeah, so I'm always willing to go over some Myrtle Beach stuff too. It's still PGA DFS, different event, but same kind of thing this week. I haven't done a whole bunch for DFS, man, but I did put some outrights out there. I'm not like an expert on the golf course when it comes to the Dunes Club that they're playing this week, but it's kind of long. Like it's a sneaky long par 71. It's like 7,500 yards. So unlike the event that we're talking about here, the Truist, where I'm not so sold out there on that bomber narrative, I would want to play some longer players over there for the Myrtle Beach Classic. So, and you said any insight, like in general there, maybe some bombers, and then I'll show you the weather real quick too, Ross. You can always take a quick little 1 minute aside to show you the weather for Myrtle Beach because it is something I was looking at. They're not playing at TPC or Myrtle Beach, by the way, but it is relatively close to where they're playing this actual event. HRRR for tomorrow looks like the AM guys could be getting a little bit of an advantage. And then over there on Friday, I believe it might even flip. Yeah, they've got some rain there in the morning. It does look a little bit windier in the afternoon, but it's going to be warmer, and they're not going to be playing through any sort of storm. So, I haven't played any DFS lineups, but like maybe going after some AM guys. And if you're playing Showdown for that, for sure, play the AM guys tomorrow. I entered some prop stuff over there for Myrtle Beach, some overs on birdies out there for the AM players. So I would definitely be using them in Showdown if I was playing that. Yeah, let me know if you need anything else, by the way, Ross. I know I didn't give you a whole bunch there, but I tried to give you some of the spark notes for Myrtle there. Who is my favorite accuracy player? So Russell Henley would have been one of them, but, just guys that rank well in accuracy percentage, it's not even so much that I like. And we'll get back to that because I was mentioning that a little bit earlier, right? It's not like I really care about off the tee that much. off the tee is not what's going to win and lose you around a Philly cricket club. It's the second shot in the putting, in my opinion. So accuracy guys that I'm using would be a Russell Henley, but it's not even so much that the accuracy is why I'm getting onto a Henley. It's that he's been nutted with the irons. It's that he's been really good putting over the last few months. It's that he's won or even nearly won at golf courses that I think are going to play pretty similar to what we have this week. I think that if you're looking at like the bomber versus accuracy thing, that you might be looking at the wrong thing. In my opinion, those other categories are what you want to focus on. But yeah, Russell Henley would be an example of that sort of player. Justin Rose, he's somebody that I bet this week over there at 66-1. He'd be an accuracy guy that I'm getting over the field on. But again, it's not that driver that's really getting me onto those sort of players. It's the other stuff that they do that is far more important, in my opinion. Am I playing McIlroy or fading? Not going to say anything definitive with my player pool here. There is obviously my Patreon page where you can see exactly what I'm doing for my player pool, but he's 35% owned. So we're going to talk about the game theory here in a second. I'll give you some of the pros and cons to doing it either way, because I don't think it's as simple as saying that he's highly owned. He's somebody you should go out there and fade. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. So I'll give you guys an idea in a second. And then you said thoughts on Cantlay. Dude hasn't won in a while, but he's trending somewhat. Yeah, you can see him on there. He is a core play for me. So kind of like Russell Henley, I love him this week. I think he's trending the right way. He's got really good bent grass putting numbers. That's part of the reason I really like him. And then if you take a look at the approach stats from 175 yards and in, he's top 25 in every proximity bucket this year. So I like the way that he's trending, as you said. I like the agronomy numbers. I like that birdie percentage for Patrick Cantlay. He's been making a lot of birdies here in 2025. All of that plus the 20-1 number to win, I thought was pretty favorable considering the kind of course fit that he has here. Yeah, give me some Patrick Cantlay. But let's talk about this ownership up top. So any other player deep dives that you guys want, feel free to go ahead and let me know. We can go through some stats, which, by the way, with Cantlay, just to show you why I like him so much, gaining a stroke per round on approach. That is exactly what we want to see. And this short game, which is usually a strength of his, has actually been just under a stroke lost per round over those last 12 measured rounds. So yeah, give me some regression with Patrick Cantlay. Now this ownership up top, let's talk about Rory McIlroy, because he's really in a tier of his own when it comes to the ownership. And you can see in my projections on my Patreon page, I've got him at about 35%. So I've got just over a third of lineups getting to Rory McIlroy. And the easy argument for wanting to go out there and fade him would be if you fade a 35% owned player and he doesn't get into the top 10, well, then you're looking at just 65% of the field that you're playing against for the rest of your lineups. Now, the other side of it is that Rory McIlroy just won the Masters. He's won multiple events this year. He's been like by far the best player that we've had on the PGA Tour out here in 2025, in that he's only 12 grand. And you might say you're crazy for saying only $12,000, but you could argue with the kind of form that he's had that he's pretty much on the same level as a Scotty right now. That Scotty, I mean, we've seen him at $13,000, even $14,000 out there for a Sunday showdown slate before. That Rory should be a lot more expensive than this $12,000. So the argument for playing Rory would be that he's too cheap. I definitely agree with that out there in a week like this, and that even if you use Rory McIlroy and you're taking a 35% owned player, that's not a death sentence. You still have 5 other players to go out there and get that leverage that you need. And because you're taking a more expensive player and you're forcing in some salary towards the top, it is going to force you down to that 6K range. And the ownership is going to be blacked out here over here for some of these 6K range players. But you can see like a Cam Davis is 2% owned. Guys like a Grazerman, who we're going to talk about later, about 4% owned. And I'm going to give you guys an idea of why I'm looking for those higher upside players down low. If you're using a Rory and then maybe taking another spend up here, 9,500 and above out there for your second man in, maybe just $9,000 and above out there for your second man in with a Rory McIlroy lineup, you're going to have to play some guys that are sub 5% owned by default because they're down there in that 6K range. So I actually think that's a positive out there with Rory McIlroy. I mentioned last week with Scotty that sure, he was going to be super, super high owned out there in GPPs, but because of what it forces you onto in the 6K range, that I actually thought you could make lineups with lower ownership and lower product ownership out there with Scotty than what you could do with lineups without him. And I can tell you last week, as somebody that played Scotty in 65% of my lineups, that was 100% true. I had 38 of my 150 lineups as 6 of 6. So about 5x the field when it came to my 6 of 6 rate. And about half of them were Scotty Scheffler lineups, where my second man in was like maybe $8,000, like maybe like $8,200, $8,300 at the very most. And then a bunch of 6K slap dicks And guess what happened? Those slapdicks played really well last week. Now, is that going to happen every single time? Absolutely not. But just because you're playing a Rory McIlroy and he's 35% owned does not mean that your lineup construction has to be a chalky lineup construction, because I can guarantee you that if you are creative about how you go out there and put together that lineup, that you can find a way to get a low-end combination out there with Rory McIlroy. And you want to be very intentional with your 6K, 7K players when you're playing that sort of lineup, because you can't just use anyone down low. There are going to be chalky guys down there in that 6K range that, for example, Tom Hoagie, who we saw a few people in chat already kind of point out, and Eric Cole here as well, are close to 10% ownership out there in GPPs. So maybe they're not the kind of guys you'd want to play in that sort of lineup where you're trying to actively leverage towards the bottom end of the board. But those are the pros and cons for a Rory, right? You fade them, it's 35% leverage. That is a ton right there. Unfortunately, the other side of it, the pros to it, are also just as strong. So, I know that somebody asked, right, what I was actually doing on it, but you guys got to remember, I do have a website that I run for myself. So it wouldn't be entirely fair for me to go out there and completely spill the beans on every single play that I'm either getting to or not getting to for any given slate. But hopefully I give you guys a little game plan then, give you guys, some of the pros and cons to make that decision for yourself, because I don't think that there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer there. Like, as you can see, I outlined some of the reasons out there for either side of that argument. Just pick a lane and run with it. The one thing I would say that you shouldn't do out there with Rory this week is play him in like 40% of lineups. Like going out there and matching the field, unless you're a 150 max player who has enough lineups to go out there and play with that sort of portfolio, get leverage on Rory. So play him in like 50% plus of your lineups, or play them in none. Go out there and fully fade them. That would be my main piece of advice. And if you're only entering like 20 lineups or 5 to 10 lineups out there in GPPs, and you're going to play Rory, consider locking them out there into those 5 to 10 lineups. If you're going to try and really make it count out there with somebody that's 35% owned, the only way to really get leverage against the field with just 10 lineups, especially like if you're going against 150 maxers like myself out there in that sort of contest, is if you lock somebody like Rory into every single lineup that you're using. So that's what I'll say about Rory up top. Obviously, a very polarizing player, I would say, this week. I've heard a lot of arguments for and against him out there in lineups, and you're going to have to make that decision for yourself, I would say. Alrighty, so let's talk about the rest of the ownership up here. So outside of Rory, it is pretty flat for these guys in the 9-10K range. You have guys like Morikawa, Schauffele at closer to 18-19%. I've got JT at about 17.5%. So no one here over that 20% mark. Aubert, slightly lower ownership because his form maybe isn't as sharp as some of those other guys around him. Guys like Henley as well, right? Maybe a little bit more overlooked than some of the other guys around him. But even Cantlay, who's your highest owned player out there in this range, is only about 20% owned. So if you have guys in this range that you like, that you wanted to go out there and bet outright, your quote unquote guys on a week like this, don't be afraid to go out there and use them in lineups. They're not the 35% ownership that you have there with a Rory, where it becomes a little bit more of a game theory decision, if whether you're going to go out there and use them out there in your lineups. When you're comparing a 20%er to a 15%er over there with Aubert, this means next to nothing to me. And I think the best way to show this to you guys is it's a 30% difference in ownership, about 33% difference in ownership out there from Aubert to Cantlay, right? Plus 33%. A plus 33% difference out here on, let's say like a 5% owned player is them going from 5 to 6.5% owned, right? And I think most people, when they're playing PGA DFS, right, they're looking at like a 6 or 7K range player. If somebody was 5% owned and somebody was 6.5% owned around them, they wouldn't care about that at all, because you shouldn't care about that. It's only a 1.5% difference in terms of the raw actual difference. That change, 15% to 20%, is the same on a relative basis. And I think a lot of people don't realize that when it comes to up top. And I actually kind of understand the argument against that too, is because you actually are playing against all those lineups out there in the GPP, right? It isn't on a relative basis that you necessarily have to compare them. But guys like Aubert, Cantlay, like if you like Cantlay, go out there and play him. You like an Aubert this week, go out there and play him too. Same thing with your Xanders, your Morikawas. I think where you really want to start considering this ownership even more is when you get down into that 8K range, is where I'm really starting to think about that game theory. And then especially in that 6 and that 7K range. So that's mostly the case there in the 9K range. 8K range, as I said, it starts to spread out a little bit more. You've got guys like Minwoo Lee at closer to 8% ownership. Sanjay McNeely also not getting a whole bunch of steam, whereas your Daniel Bergers, your Corey Connors at about 16% ownership. Even a Victor Hovland, who he's at the bottom end of that 9K range, but getting a little bit of steam for that portion of the board. Outside of like 3 guys over here, it's relatively low owned players, and some even sub 10% owned players, which we don't always find over there in that 8K range. So I'm still using my Keegan Bradleys of the world that might be getting a little bit more steam. But there are some low-owned gems, in my opinion, on this portion of the board that are definitely worthy of some consideration. And one I'll give you guys that you don't have on here as a yes right now would be a Matt McNeely. I'm playing him at sub 10% ownership. We've seen him compete in events like the Genesis this year, another signature field event, a course that I really didn't even think fit his game. Like, I like him at courses that aren't super off the tee heavy. And if my narrative this week is that it's about the iron play from 175 and in, he's better the closer he is to the hole when it comes to his irons. He's also a really good bent grass putter. You can see gaining close to about a half a stroke per round. Then yeah, I'm going to use that kind of guy as my low-owned pivots this week because he fits that sneaky narrative that I'm going out there and trying to play. So that's an example of using that game theory on this portion of the board. Above this 8K range, though, I don't want to say I'm ignoring ownership because there are some game theory pivots that, and one really big notable game theory pivot that I'm making on a week like this, the 8K range is where I'm really starting to incorporate that though. So on top of that, guys, do not play Jason Day this week. As you guys can see here, he did withdraw from the event, which I think you might see a few slapdicks that still go out there and throw him into lineups. But Patrick Rogers, his replacement down here at the bottom, has not been given a price quite yet. So we are only going to have, 71 players that actually have a price tag this week. Not going to make a massive impact when it comes to your strategy or anything like that. But do remember out there for round 2 showdown that you're probably going to be able to play Patrick Rogers for that kind of format. So unfortunate that they didn't go out there and squeak him into the player pool last second, because if they did, he would be royally underowned, because I had been checking all week to see if they'd go out there and add him to the mix, and they never did. So I'm sure that if they had gone out there and done it late, that there were probably sites that wouldn't have caught that, and we might have gone like a sub 1% owned Patrick Rogers over there this week, but unfortunately did not get our wish over there from that. Outside of that, towards the top, though, you can see the rest of the ownership numbers here. It's you can still play your guys. So, like, for example, if you like a Victor Hovland, you like a Jordan Spieth at 18.6%, I'll tell you that between Hovland and Spieth, that at least one of these 2 players is out there in my player pool. So it's not like I think it's an automatic fade at those sort of numbers. It's just that there's maybe a little bit more opportunity to get that differentiation and get that leverage to the field as some of the guys that are a little bit cheaper here. Down here in the 7K range is where the ownership really, really starts to spread out. And I am going to bring up my ownership on another tab just so I can kind of point out some of the chalk in this range. I'm going to avoid giving specific numbers just because I do have to keep some of that for my paying members. But guys like Wyndham Clark are getting some steam. I've got him over 10% ownership out there on a week like this. I've got Justin Rose, who you can see the ownership there at about 11% out there on a week like this. Keith Mitchell getting some steam. I know we mentioned that one a little bit earlier. Taylor Pendrith getting some steam out there in GPPs as well. Those kind of guys are 8% plus owned out there in every single case. And some of them 10% plus owned out there in GPPs. You've got players in this 7K range, like, for example, I'll just point one out here, Will Zalatoris, who's 5%, if not sub 5% owned out there in some of those GPPs. You've got Rasmus Højgaard, who I've got at sub 5% owned, and now he's exactly $7,000. So he's starting to get down towards the bottom end of that 7K range. But when you have players that are 4 to 6% owned, priced around guys that are 12 to 15% owned, unless you really like that player that's going to be 12 to 15% owned, you almost always going to be taking some of these ownership pivots. And it doesn't have to be that you're going to the most extreme pivots on this portion of the board, the guys that are closer to that 3 to 4% ownership mark, but even going to just some slightly lower owned players that still project out well is a really good idea out there in contests. So just to get back to the tab where we can all share this together here, like you're going to see guys like Akshay Bhatia, for example, I've got it slightly lower ownership than some of the other guys around him. And like, for example, example, he's lower owned than a Taylor Pendrith here, and I've got him at about the same projection as what you have there with Pendrith. So, if I think that Pendrith might even get steamed up a little bit because of that bomber narrative going around, then there's a chance that this ownership difference between Akshay and Pendrith is even larger than what I end up thinking. Now, you don't want to be doing this like when it's like a 1% difference out there between player to player. Like we mentioned before, you want it to be a significant difference out there from option to option. So maybe like a 5%er compared to somebody that's closer to like 10% owned. But those are the kind of game theory pivots that you want to be making when we have no idea what to expect from this golf course. And I mean, we talk about this every single week out here on tour, even when we know the golf course that's at hand. But in the game theory and getting leverage versus the rest of the field is even more so important to go out there and do when nobody knows what to expect from the venue. So that's why I look for a lot of my ownership pivots on this portion of the board. And Akshay Bhatia would be an example of that sort of guy. And it's not like he has the best form or anything like that, but if you go to the last 24 measured rounds, he's gaining on approach and he's gaining with the putter. And when you zoom in on the proximity buckets for an Akshay, he's gaining from 175 yards and in most of those proximity buckets. I think one of the buckets from 175 and in, he was slightly worse than average player, but the rest of them top 50 out there on the PGA Tour. And then the putter has also been a bright spot lately. And if I think this is going to be a little bit of a putting contest, a little bit of a birdie fest around this kind of venue, I want guys that are hot with the irons and hot with the putter. And sure, the other two categories could be a little bit better, but that's why he's going to be a little bit lower owned than the guys around him, right? He doesn't have the best form compared to, let's say, a Ben Griffin, who has a win over his last few starts. A Pendrith, who the form's actually only just about a half a stroke better per round, but that half a stroke difference is going to lead to a pretty decent gap when it comes to that ownership there. And see. So if you guys didn't see my video from earlier this week, I do like McIntyre still. McIntyre, by the way, is a relatively low-owned pivot that you can take in that 8K range. So I know he was towards the bottom there, so maybe skipped my eyes there at first. But yeah, Robert McIntyre pivot that we can throw out there as well. Rose, I wouldn't consider a pivot, but I still really do like him around this kind of event. Reason for that, and then we mentioned some of like the accuracy first sort of players. He fits that Henley mold. Really good approach play lately. Amazing bent grass putting stats, gaining 0.6 strokes bent grass putting per round. And if you go to the last 12 measured rounds, you'll see that iron play that I was hinting at. He's gaining over 0.75 shots gained approach out there per round and has been solid elsewhere, only losing out there around the green. So give me some Justin Rose around what I think isn't a super off the tee heavy golf course. What else do we have here? So Matty Fitz, another low-owned guy that you can take here in that 6K range. Another example of these low-owned players that I'm looking for. Matty Fitz, I thought was a good course fit. If you guys saw my breakdown earlier this week on my channel, he's somebody that's kind of rounding into form, and I use kind of because it's a stretch to say that he's rounding into form, but he has played better his last 3-4 events than he has the last year. Last year, it's been like all missed cuts. He has a few top 25s lately, so that's why I say he's kind of coming into form, but really good bent grass putting stats, just like you had there with the Justin Rose. And if you remember, that's one of the things I'm looking for this week. Also, iron play from 175 yards and in. And while he's struggled with the long irons at some of these more difficult venues, signature events that you've had this year, Matty Fitz has missed cuts or finished in like dead last out there in some of these no-cut events. You know where he's been okay this year, and I'll stress okay because it hasn't been great for Matty Fitz. He's been okay from 175 yards and in. So these are the kind of lower-owned guys that I'm getting to this week that, one, fit my narrative, and of course are going to be lower owned than some of the other guys around them. I've also got a Max Graziman out there in some lineups. A little bit of a different idea out here with Max. This isn't a course fit play with Max Graziman. This is all about the upside in his birdie or better percentage. He's a long player off the tee, so I guess if you're a bomber guy, you could play Max Graziman and have even more faith in him out there in your lineups. But he's a high birdie guy because of how well he putts the ball, and he's also a player that can take advantage of the par fives. And you can see it, I guess, an added little bonus over here. He's the best bent grass putter that we have in the field, gaining just under a stroke per round over there on the bent grass surface. So, you know, if I'm running that out there as my narrative for the week, I can get them at sub 5% ownership. These are the kind of pivots I'm taking down here in that 6K range. It compared to your Eric Close or Tom Hoagies, who I have at closer to 6-7% ownership this week. That's nearly half the ownership. If you get to a Fitz, nearly half the ownership if you go down to a Max Graziman. And in my opinion, those are the kind of ownership pivots that you should be thinking about on this sort of week. And it doesn't have to be Graziman or a Matty Fitz that you use. There are other guys in this range that are also low owned. For example, like no one's going to use Homa. Maybe that's for the best because he sucks now. He, even lost his caddy at this point. So maybe he's not the best pivot to play down here, but like an Adam Scott, Maybe he's in a few my builds this week. Maybe I'm hinting at that. Maybe a Lucas Glover could make some sense as a pivot. Good ball striking stats, right? Not the best putter. Now, if you're looking at the birdie or better stuff in a putting contest, maybe you don't love the Lucas Glover here, but there are guys in this range that are guys that aren't terrible players. Like, you're going from guys that are better plays. That's why they're chalk out there in contests. The guys that are slightly worse plays, but it's like comparing shit to shit, right? You're in the 6K range down here for a reason. You're not finding the 9K, 10K guys that go bare at this portion of the board. If you have half the ownership on guys that are even competent plays down here in this portion of the board, you should be highly considering making that pivot. And then the last guy I'm going to throw out here, just to give you some perspective into what I'm looking for out there in players, would be a Cam Davis, who is another one of these high upside players. In fact, just to give you an idea of how high upside he is, he's the number 3 birdie or better percentage player in all the PGA Tour. Number 1's Rory, number 2 is Scotty Scheffler, number 3 is Cameron Davis. So if you're looking for somebody that can go out there and outscore their placement, you're not going to find any better player down here at this portion of the board. He's also okay in bent grass. He is a slight positive out there putting on bent. And last week, he had one of his better starts of the year out there at an easier golf course. So it's not the best course fit on paper. I mean, I didn't even say the same thing with Grazerman other than the putting out there with the bent grass putting stats. But give me these guys that make a whole bunch of birdies on what should be a soft and gettable golf course. So hopefully it gives you guys a little bit of perspective into what I'm looking for out there in players. And again, if you agree with these takes on guys, feel free to go ahead and use them yourself. If you don't, though, there are plenty of other pivots you can take at this portion of the board that aren't going to be as mega chalky as some of the others. And I'm going to go ahead and look at my other sheet once again and show you some of the chalk in this range. So for example, down there in that 6K range, I've got EVR as your highest owned guy that is under $6,500. I've got Michael Thorbjornsen getting a little bit more ownership than I would like down there in this range. I've got Ryan Gerard. I already mentioned Hoagie and Cole also getting a little bit of steam there. Outside of those 5, maybe 6 players, the rest of the 6K range is like 2-3 percenters. Like, especially the bottom end of the 6K range, they've got a whole bunch of players that you can take at sub 3%. If you're starting with a Rory lineup and you have to get different off that 35%, and especially if you use another spend up to really force yourself down here into the 6K range, you're going to have plenty of options to go out there and make that happen. So that's what I'll say about the bottom end of the board here. And yeah, some ideas for players to go out there and consider as well. Let me catch up on any player poll questions that you've got, and then we're going to hop over to DraftKings for a last second look at some of the DFS stuff. So thoughts on Brian Campbell. So Campbell's ownership is extremely low. He's also nearly min price. In fact, exactly at that min price of $6,000. And if it is going to be a golf course where you don't have to be a bomber off the tee, then that would play directly into his skill set. So if you are somebody that's playing that narrative this week, I don't think it's the worst idea to play a Brian Campbell. Full transparency, I don't think he's my favorite play. I'm not using him out there in my lineups myself, but he's especially like if you're looking for guys down here to fit that narrative, he's like him, maybe a Chris Kirk, maybe a Nick Taylor would be some of your like more positional drivers. Down low, I'm more on these like high upside guys, kind of like the Cameron Davises, the Max Grazermans of the world. When I get to the player deep dives, could we look up Thigala, Woodland, and Hadwin? Absolutely. So let's start with Thigala. So Thigala's price tag is part of the deep dive that we have to do here because there's a reason why he's at $6,900. Right now, having his best season so far, missing a lot of cuts, which isn't really what we're used to seeing from Sahith. However, if we go to the last 12 measured rounds, he's not that far off. Like, he's gaining on approach. It's the short game that's really been holding a Sahith back. So that price tag is real juicy at $6,900. I do think that he's going to get clicked this week just because of that. So he's not going to be like sub 5% owned or anything like that at that kind of number. But I like him quite a bit, especially if you're in a large field GPP. And then you got what? Woodland and Hadwin as the other two. Let's see. So Woodland had to take a week off. My main concern with Woodland would be the health and why he had to withdraw. But before he withdrew at the last event at the Byron Nelson, he was one of my favorite plays for that week. And it's because of this form. He's losing around the green. The other 3 categories that we care about the most this week, lights out over here in that 6K range. So the Gary Woodland deep dive is that he's super cheap. The stats look amazing. It's just that we have no idea how the health is really holding up for him. And then the last one was who? Hadwin. It'd be the last one to go through here. So Hadwin, losing on approach, so losing about 0.6 strokes per round, neutral off the tee, gaining around the green, and then losing with the putter. He's like a 4 out of 10. The other two are kind of like, though. Mav's been killing these elevated events too that aren't majors of the players. Yeah, man. I mean, Genesis, he popped off. He popped at API. If he does it again, I'll be glad because I think he's going to be low owned as well. He said Gary withdrawed on us last week. Pittsburgh guy seems like he could be a good fit for this course too. Yeah, so I hope that he plays well just because I'm a huge fan of Gary Woodland. But that injury stuff is kind of scaring me, man. I'm not exactly sure why he withdrew. I'm not sure if we had an exact word on it. I know it was health-based. They said it was some sort of an injury that caused him to withdraw, which is why I have some concern. You said you asked DraftKings support earlier, said Rogers would not be added. Dude, he would have been such a good low-owned play. And I can tell you now, there will be showdown sites out there that don't put him in their round 2 stuff. Maybe we can find the edge that way out there on a low-owned Patty Rogers. And then you said thoughts on Harman and Finau. So yeah, Brian Harman, man, he's been playing some golf lately. So to give you the shots gained on Brian Harman, you can see they're gaining in every category but off the tee. And it is aggressive shots gained out there in all these different categories, especially if you're a believer in the shorter course kind of stuff, thinking that you don't have to be a bomber to find success. Brian Harman's the kind of player that you're going to see me on. And I'll just say it, I'm using him out there in some lineups this week because he fits that narrative that I'm looking for. Then the other one was Finau, right? Finau, good ball striking stats, not so good out there with the short game. But Tony Finau is streaky when it comes to the short game categories. Oftentimes, he'll pop out of nowhere to go out there and gain 3-4 shots gained on the greens. And when he does, he's oftentimes in contention to go out there and win. So, yeah, Brian Harman's like a 7 out of 10. This stat profile, especially because of what you guys know I think about the golf course, I'm not against it at all. Then, yeah, Tony Finau, I'm always a good ball striking guy. Always looking for those ball striking candidates. And then you said, you're kind of pissed about it. Yeah, me too, man. You'd think the DraftKings interns could go out there and add a few guys to the player pool, but I guess we're asking too much from them at this point. They haven't set the bar too high when it comes to their expectations. All right, let's talk about this contest selection. So I don't have much to say about the contest selection, other than it's pretty typical for what we get for these main slates, other than that this might overlay, and if it does, it's going to be pretty sweet. So this is the $3 150 max, something that they've been experimenting on the last few weeks. It's a really good payout structure. It's 10% to first, and it's pretty flat afterwards as well, out there with the rest of the top 10. And if it overlays, you can see there's still like 50-something thousand entries that they've got to go out there and get into this. So it's less than halfway full. Less than a day out there before lock. This is a contest that all of you should be going out there and max entering. And I know now that I said that, it's probably going to jump up in entries over the next few hours, but it's true. It's a good payout structure, but overlays that'll be even better out there for the community. But outside of that, you can see I max entered that. I also max entered the big drive the green this week over there with the 150 max. The rest of my exposure on top of that is all single entries. So $100 single entries, $33, $12, $5 single entries, going out there and sprinkling some exposure. And for a lot of you guys out there, like your average PGA DFS hobbyist, you should be looking at a lot of those single entry contests because you're playing against people that can't 150 max against you, a lot flatter payout structures than what you have in some of those GPPs. And like even this drive the green that I'm playing in is super top heavy. It's a fourth to first place. That's why if you're going to 150 max on a week like this, do it in the $3 150 max. Like that contest is absolutely nutted. These kind of contests should be reserved for the pros like myself that are playing these contests every single week, that can fully afford to go out there and 150 max, that have a long-term mindset when it comes to binking these things. Because unless you're finishing first place or getting, second prize over there with $20,000, long-term, you're going to be a loser in these sort of contests. And not even just a loser, you're going to be a big loser in these sort of contests because they have some of the highest rake of the GPPs that they have on the site. And you have to beat a lot more people than what you have in those other contests, right? It's a lot harder, and it's pretty intuitive, but I'll point it out just in case it wasn't. It's a lot harder to beat 50,000 other people than it is to beat like a couple hundred people in a single entry. And sure, you might have less chances to go out there and take it down, but a lot of people out there that are watching content like this aren't even 150 maxing a contest like this. For example, they'll take 20 lineups in this contest, $100, put it out here into the big $5 GPP. And a lot of times you're just burning that money on fire because you're playing against 150 maxers like myself. You're playing against 50,000 entries with just a small portfolio of lineups. I would much rather people watching this go out there and take that $100, right? There's 20 lineups that you might put in the $5 and just give me $100 single entry. Or enter the $33 single entry, $12 single entry, $5 single entry. Now that's $50 right there. And maybe you can find the secondaries for the $33, $12, and $5 single entries, and you could do $100 that way and go out there and enter lineups. And that way you can still have a bunch of lineups, or you can still have, in that case, 6 lineups out there with your $100 if you double it up out there on those smaller GPPs. But that is a it's not even close. It's like a 10 times better strategy long-term than going out there and entering these big GPPs. So if you have the bankroll for it, if you're somebody that's willing to have the ups and downs that are included with entering some of these big GPPs, then go for it. I do. This is my thing. I play PGA DFS every single week. I've got some big weeks that I have every single year, and I have a lot of weeks where I lose money out there in those sort of contests. I'm super transparent about that. I used to do review shows every single week where I showed exactly how much I was winning and losing every single week. Those kind of contests, you kind of got to know what you're signing up for before you go out there and enter them. Maybe you didn't know that about entering them. Maybe you're new to the space, or you hadn't really thought about the payout structures of some of these different kind of contests. And by the way, this sand trap is even worse when it comes to the top end payout. It's a little bit more than a fourth that they're giving out there to first place. And I mean, look how far it drops off. After third place, you're down to the second place of the $5 GPP. And to max enter this for $25, right, it's nearly $4,000 that you're going out there and entering. So unless you have that sort of bankroll, like, I mean, if I wanted to this week, I could go out there and max enter this, right? I've got 12 grand in my DraftKings account right now. I'm not doing that, right? I don't see a reason to go out there and do so with this kind of payout structure. Now, if it was $1 million contest and it was 100,000 to first place, and second through 10th were reasonable when it comes to that payout structure, then maybe I would go out there and max enter that. But you're not going to see that from me on a week like this. In terms of lineup construction this week, it is all about the lineup, all about ownership for me. I'm not playing weather at all, which is the 2-hour spread on tee times. I might be going out there and stacking skill sets and some of my single entries, like maybe taking a bomber lineup, maybe taking a lineup with just accuracy guys, maybe taking a lineup with just guys that are good bent grass putters. But a majority of my lineups is just making sure that I have enough leverage out there involved. So to show you that, we're going to build a lineup here together that is, let's assume it's out there for the big $25 GPP that we were just going over there for the contest selection segment. Let's build a lineup for that. So let's do one with Rory, and then we're going to do one without Rory afterwards. So the one with Rory, the reason why I want to do this is just to show you where if you take him plus another spend up, it kind of forces you towards the bottom end of the board. So I'm going to throw in a Rory, and then I'm going to throw in a Patrick Cantlay as my second man in. I'm not playing Rory this week. I guess I'll just say it flat out. I'm fading him this week. If it burns me, it burns me. So be it. I'm not playing a 35% owned player that I think is a loser and doesn't fit the golf course. So if let's start with super chalky Rory as our first man in. Let's go with Cantlay as our second man in. Super chalky. Again, 20% as your second man in here. This isn't the end of the world. If you want to start with these two players, I obviously am not going to have this exact combination out there in any sort of GPPs this week. But if you did, you could still get all the differentiation that you need out there with your last 4 spots, because you can see over here, now we're down to just 71.25 remaining per player. So you're going to have like one more 7K guy that you go out here and throw in here, but maybe you avoid the Justin Roses that are like 12% owned. Maybe you avoid some of the guys that are closer to like 8 to 10% owned as well. And you consider a pivot like a Tony Finau instead, where you're getting slightly lower ownership and you're getting somebody that is sub 7% owned. Instead of taking, let's say, a chalkier player like a Pendrith or even Bhatia. I've got Bhatia at like 7%. Maybe that's where you force in a lower owned Will Zalatoris to go out there and offset some of that ownership. So it's not who you play, right? You can use Rory even at 35%, as long as you're making these kind of ownership decisions further down the board. So, Rasmus would be a super low owned player. Now, what I don't like about using Rory, and then especially like Cantlay as a second man in, if you're going to use Rory, is it does kind of force your hand down here. You're not able to play some of the better plays in the 7K range because of the kind of ownership that they have behind them, but it's not impossible to go out there and make that kind of lineup work. So that would be a Rory McIlroy lineup where you're really getting most of your differentiation down towards the bottom end of the board. The other aspect would be if you went off of a Rory McIlroy, you are going to be a little bit more balanced, and some of your leverage might come in the 8K range in this sort of lineup. So let's start with a Xander as our first man in. Second man in, we're going to use a Henley, and this is going to be partial leverage there, right? Like even he's a little bit lower owned than some of the other guys around him. We're going to throw in a McNeely to this lineup. They're $8,300, also a little bit lower owned than some of the other players around them. And now we're at about like 7,400 remaining. So, if he really wanted to play Rose, you could still probably make it work in this kind of lineup, as long as your last two players here are where you're getting that sort of leverage. So for the sake of this, we're not going to take Justin Rose, just because if we did that, it was going to force us onto the same sort of pivots that we had in that other lineup. And I want to show you where you can get different on a different portion of the board. So let's go up here and find a pivot in this top end of the 7K range. There's not a lot of guys that I would consider pivots on this portion of the board, but remember Robert McIntyre that I was talking about before? Right? He's like 5% owned and he's $8,000. So a way to get different might be to spend up a little bit, right, from a Justin Rose, get to that sub 5% owned player, because not only are we getting lower raw ownership going from a Rose to a McIntyre, but it's also changing up our lineup construction a little bit. It's making us go a little bit further down the board. Our next man in here, maybe we go out there and we throw a bot to you there. And then your last man in here, as long as they aren't over 5 to 6% owned, you're probably smooth sailing with this kind of build in any contest that you're entering. If this was a single entry, a smaller field GPP, as opposed to like that big $5, $25 GPP, then you would for sure be fine out there in those sort of contests. So that's what I've got out there from the lineup construction segment, going out there and making sure that you have enough leverage so that first off, you can move up in the GPPs if you end up getting your plays correct, but also so that you're not duplicating yourself out there with any other lineups. But that's all I've got out here for the DFS live stream this week. Hopefully I feel a little bit more prepared for all the contests, all the sort of lineups that you're going out there and entering. And I can see you guys out there towards the top of some of those GPPs. It should be a lot of fun. We've got a full field event, a brand new golf course to go out there and break down. And of course, for rounds 2 through 4 showdown, we're doing the live streams over here on the SHIPIT Nation YouTube as well. Those will be after play ends on each day. So make sure to stay tuned to my Twitter, also the SHIPIT Nation Twitter, so you guys can catch exactly when those are going to be starting, but probably around like 7 or either 8 p.m. Eastern time is where we're going to have most of those going live. So stay tuned for all of that around the weekend. Subscribe so you guys don't miss when we're going live for all those different live streams. And for the prop and betting stuff over here tonight, we're going to be going live any second now over there on my YouTube channel. So I'm going to give myself a few minutes, go get a sip of water, maybe a snack, and then we'll be going live over there, going through all the underdog and price pick stuff over there for round number 1, as well as all the matchup bets and other outright bets over there on the sports book. So if you're somebody that enters the prop stuff over there on like underdog price picks, make sure to check out my YouTube channel for that. That's LukeDFS, by the way. If you guys don't already follow me or subscribe to my YouTube channel, make sure to check that out for even more content out here this year. We've got the course breakdowns over there in my YouTube channel. We've got the prop live streams that I do for every single day as well, on top of the showdown stuff that you see over here on SHIPIT. But it's all I've got, guys. Best of luck with everything that you guys are going with. And I will see if there's any last second questions, though, before we hop on out of here. He said, you heard that Mav is striping it, same as Keegan's and Hovland. I like to hear that in all three of them. I like all three of those players. So good stuff, man. And he said, can I rank Connors, Berger, or Lowry for a small single entry? So smaller single entry, I don't think we have to obsess about the ownership with those three players. And they're all in good form, especially Connors. So he's in the best form of those three players. Berger's in solid form himself there. If I had to rank the three, especially taking the ownership out of it because it is in that small single entry and it's not the biggest deal, I would go Berger, Connors, then Lowry. If I was in a GPP, I would go Lowry, Berger, then Connors. Lowry would actually go to number 1 in a GPP because he's the lowest owned out of those three, but you're in a single entry, so don't worry about it. And he said, thanks, Luke. Let's climb those leaderboards. Amen to that. What's going on, Angelina? Of course, Brant. Appreciate the kind words down there. And yeah, big Luke gang, man. Let's get after it this week. But that's all I've got, guys. Best luck out there with all the exposure that you guys are getting to. And I see you guys for those live streams throughout the weekend.